Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Your Hour with APA Virginia is hosted on the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get logged in and get settled. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, we want to remind you of a couple of exciting things APA Virginia has coming up and a couple housekeeping items. Join us October 12th through the 16th for APA Virginia's virtual conference. Registration can be found on apavirginia.com. This year's conference will include keynote and plenary sessions, breakout sessions with live Q&A, and daily releases of on-demand sessions. Throughout the conference, APA Virginia will host our annual award ceremony, along with a number of networking opportunities. Office hours will be available throughout the week so attendees can connect with staff and APA Virginia board members to ask questions and share feedback and network. Please keep an eye out for information on next month's webinar. As we do every month, this webinar, Affordable Housing, will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page by the end of the day. We encourage you to visit our YouTube and see past webinars or share it with colleagues. As a reminder, we will hold questions until the end, but as the webinar is going on, feel free to type your questions in the question box on your dashboard, and we will answer them at the end in the order they came in. Again, thank you to the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. We are always looking for new webinar presenters or topics, so if you have one you would like us to look into, please email admin@apavirginia.com. As a reminder, please look to our website and social media for updates on all chapter events and engagement opportunities. This month's webinar, Affordable Housing, is presented by Michael McKenzie. Michael is a researcher at VCU's Center for Urban and Regional Analysis and the director of VCU's Land Use Education Program. Mike has written or co-written analysis of future housing needs, impediments to fair housing choice, and economic impact in jurisdictions across Virginia. Mike has also served as a researcher at Housing Opportunities Made Equal and a green specialist at Community Housing Partners. Mike has received a master's degree in urban and regional planning from VCU in 2011. Next up, we have Jonathan Knopf. Jonathan is the vice president at HDAdvisors, providing data collection and analysis for affordable housing nonprofits across Virginia. He specializes in using GIS to create static and interactive maps that help tell the story of housing needs throughout the state. Jonathan has a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Commonwealth University, where he also earned undergraduate degrees in political science and environmental studies. He is a Richmond native and volunteers with the Maymont Foundation to help build a GIS platform for the historic estate in Arboretum. At this time, I will now mute myself and hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much. We're happy to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen here. My name is Mike McKenzie, and I'm here with Jonathan Knopf to talk about housing and affordability here on September 28th. I work with the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis. I'm also the director of VCU's Land Use Education Program. Jonathan Knopf works with Housing Forward Virginia. And one of the issues that we come up against frequently, either in the land use education program, speaking with planning commissioners, or speaking with citizens, anybody that we're working with on a report, is coming up with a definition for affordable. We often hear from people, well, when you say affordable, what does that mean? Affordable to whom? And it can be defined a number of ways. When we get to the single household, it's very simple. We say affordable means that housing costs are no more than 30% of the household's income. But when we start talking about an entire community, it gets more difficult, and we say affordability is relative to the median family income. But there's a number of factors in there that complicate it. When we talk about affordability between households and units, housing units, those are two different things. Households being the family unit, the household unit, units being the domicile in which people are living. We often separate them into categories based on the percent of the area median income that a housing unit costs or is likely to cost per year, or is affordable to a particular income group. So we say households or housing units earn at or are affordable at over 120% on the far right column. As we move left, we say 101 to 120%, 81 to 100% of the area median income, all the way down to 30% and below the area median income. We're going to get into explaining this graph a bit more in a bit, but I wanted to show you how complicated it can get to try to describe affordability accurately in between the household expenses, household unit income, and when we talk about households and housing units, those come with a number of other factors in terms of household income, how many people are in the household. When we say a household is earning at the median income, that means different things for a household of 2 people or a household of 5 people. In terms of housing units, the cost, the affordability also depends on the number of bedrooms. A housing unit that costs $1,200 per month is going to be much more affordable at 5 bedrooms than it is at 2 bedrooms. So the same cost can have different levels of affordability. As an example of how we look at putting affordability into fewer numbers, we are looking at the HUD income limits for 2020 in the Richmond region. On the left-hand side, you can see the median family income for the area, the AMI, which is $89,400. As we look at the top row, we see persons in family ranging from 1 to 8. And on the left, we've got the income category limits between low at the bottom, that's low, 80% of the area median income, very low at the top, 50% of the area median income, and extremely low in the middle row, which is generally 30% of the area median income. And right there in the middle is 4 persons in the family. You've got the area median income at exactly 80%. Here are low income limits, 80% income limits is exactly $71,500 for a 4-person family. So the 4-person family is the baseline. But as we decrease the number of people in the family or increase the number of people in the family, that number changes. And how we change that in order to account for the number of different people in a household is looking at the median family income over here, $89,400, and decreasing or increasing that number as a relative point as the number of people in a family change. So 100%, 4-person family is our baseline. We decrease that number as the persons in the family goes down. 3 people in the family, we make these limits relative to 90% of the median family income here on the left, $89,400. 2 people, it's 80% of that number. So the calculation would be for an low income at the bottom, 80% of the area median income. When we look at a 2-person family, we're not saying 80% of 89,400, we're saying 80% of 89,400, which is 57,200. Housing units follow a similar practice. Housing unit affordability is the cost of that unit relative to the area median income. Now, how we look at this is often in terms of the monthly rent or the monthly housing costs times 12, so the annual costs, divided by 0.3, which gives us the annual income needed for the housing costs to equal 30% of a person's income. So we would consider that affordable. The income needed, the annual income needed, divided by the area median income is the percent of the area median income that income represents. So for example, we've got a $1,200 housing unit per month times 12, that's $14,400 is the annual income needed to live in that unit. Divided by 0.30 on the line below, we've got an annual income of $48,000, which is the limit at which that housing unit becomes affordable. If we divide 48,000 by the median income that we identified earlier in the Richmond region, median family income, or the AMI, of $89,400, the $48,000 income is 53.7% of the AMI. So when we say this $1,200 unit, $1,200 a month unit is affordable, what we mean is that it's affordable to people earning 53.7% of the AMI, or if we put it in a range, we might say 50 to 60% of the AMI, or below 75% of the AMI. However, housing units have different numbers of bedrooms. That's going to impact what families can live there, how affordable it really is. We have to adjust those medians based on the number of bedrooms. A one-bedroom unit is going to be relatively more expensive than a four-bedroom unit at the same cost because it can house fewer people. And to do that, what we do is we adjust the median income reference point once again, as we did with the households, depending on the number of people in it. So a one-bedroom unit, we're going to adjust the baseline AMI to far less, 0.70. A four-bedroom unit, we're going to increase it slightly by a factor of 0.04, 4%. So just for example, a one-bedroom apartment at $1,200, as in the previous example, we've got a $48,000 housing cost or income required to make that housing affordable. And when we considered a one-bedroom apartment, rather than in the previous slide, it being affordable at the 50 to 60% level, it's now affordable at the 70 to 80% level, 76.7% AMI, because we've adjusted that median income right here in red, 89,400 times 0.70. It becomes comparatively less affordable in terms of the way that we describe it. Weighting avoids classifying all small units. Small units being fewer bedrooms as affordable. So when we have a $1,200 unit, at these different bedrooms, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are affordable at the following percent AMI. One bedroom is affordable at 76% AMI, meaning people earning 76% or above the area median income can afford that bedroom. At 4 bedrooms, it becomes 51.6% AMI, meaning it's approaching a level of deep affordability, as an entire family can live in the same unit at $1,200. That allows us to compare apples to apples, as we see in this chart that we showed earlier. When we put households and housing units into these income categories of affordability, they have been weighted depending on the number of bedrooms and depending on the number of people in the household. So once we have understood the methodology at which we are trying to make units and housing, or excuse me, housing units and households more understandable at income levels, depending on the number of people, depending on the number of bedrooms, we have to get the data somewhere. One place that you can access this data is through HUD, Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data. It's often a bit behind. As you can see, the most recent data year is ACS estimates between 2013 and 2017, but it will give you these crosstabs of households by different income levels. And if you go through and download the data set, you can also get access to the number of housing units at different affordability levels. More detailed data you can get from public use microdata samples. This is essentially person level data from ACS estimates, sample level data. The pros of that are that you can create custom crosstabs, really looking at information by crosstabs of age, household size. You get a lot of extra detail in there. The cons of that are that it's not a very intuitive system, requires some specialized knowledge and some specialized software, and it's limited to large geographies. Accessing PUMS data, be it through the Census Bureau or through iPUMS, you can only access it at the regional level, or larger cities are often a microdata area. Another thing that we've come across recently is looking for alternatives to data.census.gov, the new census data storehouse since American Fact Finder has been mothballed. NHGIS is an excellent alternative to the census website. Looking for archival data, it can often be a little bit behind. And another one, which requires a bit more, once again, specialized understanding, is to use R and the Tidy Census API, whereby if you load two libraries, understand just a small bit of coding, a few lines can get you a table. This would get us a table of, I believe, age by sex at the county level for ACS year ending in 2018 for the state of Virginia and the city of Richmond. I would stop here for questions, but we're taking them at the end, but you can always email me at McKenziem2@vcu.edu, and we'll hang on for additional questions. And I'll turn it over to Jonathan Knopf.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to see if I can take control of your computer now, which I think, Mike, maybe you have to stop moving your mouse for a second, and it should give me control. Let's see. There we go. Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mike, for diving into the basics of really the core aspects of the data that we use to understand housing in different communities. And thank you, Paige, for organizing this, and thanks to everybody else for being here on this Monday. So I will shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the bigger picture, how we talk about housing, how housing fits into our bigger conversations about planning, and what we from Housing Forward Virginia's perspective are really looking at here in the second half of 2020, as this year has really forced us to encounter some major issues that none of us were really expecting when the year first rolled around. So Housing Forward Virginia is the new name for an organization that many of you are probably familiar with. We were formerly Housing Virginia. We have undergone a slight rebrand to refresh ourselves for the next generation and to kind of better position ourselves in the world of housing organizations and nonprofits across the Commonwealth. But we are the, I like to call us the think tank for affordable housing here in Virginia. We provide data, research, trainings, all sorts of things to help planners and practitioners across the state understand housing, learn how to talk about it, learn about the policies, and learn how to increase housing opportunities and access in their own communities. So many of you have probably heard about this term, the housing spectrum. And so Mike alluded to this earlier when he was showing those bar graphs that break down housing units and households by AMI range, area median income. And that data is really important for helping us understand the types of different policy interventions and solutions that are required along this housing spectrum, because we know that not everybody owns their house, and conversely, not everybody is without a house. And we know that there is a lot of different housing needs and housing opportunities in between to help provide housing equality throughout the entire income and household spectrum. So we try to break this down into a framework that's easy to understand and hopefully easy for planners to then take to the public when talking about housing, to get public citizens who may not think about housing beyond their own front door to understand that this is a community issue. So at one end of the housing spectrum, at the lower end of income, so thinking about below 30% AMI, we have persons who are experiencing homelessness. This is the lowest rung on the housing ladder. So we solve this by having centralized intake systems through local planning groups or continuums of care. We have emergency shelters, and we have faith-based charities, churches, other nonprofit groups that may provide meals, other assistance. So we have this entire industry around helping persons that do not currently have a home. Once those people are able to experience a little bit of security and maybe get into a system to allow them to get into some more permanent type of housing, then we move up to rapid rehousing or supportive housing. These are tools to help persons that have experienced homelessness get into more permanent housing solutions. So in this case, they may be able to secure a job, overcome some legal barriers maybe that they were encountering, and get rapidly rehoused into permanent housing, or perhaps if they have health issues or substance abuse issues, mental health issues, there is permanent supportive housing which will give them wraparound services in order to stay stably housed. And so this rung of the housing spectrum is often solved by mission-driven nonprofits, which are supported by federal, state, local grants. A lot of federal dollars go into this, but also state and local money, as well as private philanthropic support. As we move closer towards half of median income, about 50% AMI or so, and thereabouts, we have public housing and housing vouchers and other types of deeply assisted rental housing. So public housing authorities administer this housing. Voucher administrators, which are sometimes public housing authorities, sometimes social service departments, other nonprofits, will provide housing vouchers to help cover rents for households earning below a certain amount of AMI, generally 80%, and to help them provide, find and access housing that is affordable to them on the private market. And so these are primarily funded through federal dollars that flow through HUD down to the states and localities. And then we have rental housing that is often mixed in with market rate housing. So we have affordable rental that may be affordable because of particular subsidies or programs, or may be affordable just because of the market conditions. So market rate affordable or naturally occurring affordable housing, what we call NOAA. And so this can be satisfied through low-income housing tax credit development, LIHTC, which is the #1 producer of dedicated affordable units in the country and in Virginia. Inclusionary zoning in the few places here in Virginia where we do have that, where developers will set aside a certain number of units to be affordable in market rate development in exchange for density bonuses or other incentives. These can be satisfied by nonprofit developers or for-profit developers. And another source of naturally occurring market affordable housing in many places is manufactured housing in mobile home parks. And this is something that more and more people are paying attention to in Virginia, especially as Wall Street and investors come into these communities and understand that there's a lot of money to be made because it's a captive audience, because the need is so great and the supply of affordable housing is so low. And so many communities and many planners are beginning to rethink how they approach mobile home parks and see them perhaps as something that should be preserved or revitalized in some way, as opposed to redeveloped in entirety. And then we get into homeownership. Homeownership is something that the federal government plays a huge role in terms of the mortgage interest deduction and other grants and resources that again flow down through states and localities. Many other philanthropic organizations and corporations may provide first-time homebuyer grants, other assistance to help people who may otherwise have a good job and good income but limited savings get into home ownership. And this is a space where a lot of nonprofit developers also help satisfy the needs. Habitat for Humanity is probably the most common example. And then once we get into 80% AMI and above, this is generally housing that the market is going to provide without any type of particular subsidy or government intervention beyond general land use guidelines and zoning. And subsidy is rarely needed at this level of income, except for very high cost metros. San Francisco, DC, New York, because housing costs are so high, even if incomes are pretty high too, there may be still a mismatch between what is affordable at that level and what folks are actually bringing home to pay, especially if commuting costs are very high, the cost of living is very high. This kind of is an example of why defining affordable is very important in the ways that Mike talked about earlier. So how do we approach this spectrum? How can planners and housing practitioners just get a handle on how to intervene along the spectrum to increase housing opportunity and make housing more affordable? If you go back to your Econ 101 class, we can do this through the supply side, or we can do it through the demand side. We can make affordable housing, which is literally creating units that are affordable in some way. We can do this by changing our zoning to increase density, which will often make the cost of housing development lower. We can build public housing, which is something the federal government undertook for many decades, but is now no longer a program that exists. We have these thousands of units that are grandfathered in, but the federal government does not build any more public housing. We have a large system of subsidies, incentives, and tax credits that the federal government and state governments use to interface with nonprofit and for-profit developers to build housing that is affordable. The low-income housing tax credit LifeTech program is probably the best known example of that. We have nonprofits that are exclusively dedicated to the production of affordable housing. We have many of those in Virginia. We actually have a very robust network of nonprofit housing developers. And then we also have alternative tenure models. So things like cooperatives, community land trust, things that occupy a space between rental and home ownership that may make housing more affordable because there is shared cost and there's a model that brings down the upfront cost for housing to begin with in exchange for a not entirely fee simple ownership of that housing. And then on the household side, we can make existing housing more affordable by providing assistance to households through housing choice vouchers, through rent control, which is not something that is legal in Virginia, but is found in some other metro areas across the country. We can increase the wages that people are paid so they can afford housing more easily on the market. We can provide grants, assistance to home buyers, and we can, especially for seniors and low-income, high-risk groups, we can undertake housing rehab and weatherization to, for example, reduce energy burdens that people may have, whether it's their heating cost or their cooling cost. We can take older housing and rehabilitate it to make it more efficient and to lower the operating cost for that housing, especially if it's a senior who has paid off their home and their only cost might be utilities and property taxes. Another big theme that we have really seen come about in the past 5 or 10 years in Virginia is the importance of regionalism. So we have to have our cities, which are often the place where most people think about affordable housing being a high need. We have to think about those cities interfacing with our suburbs, which have seen rapid demographic changes in many areas, especially around our large metros in Hampton Roads, Richmond, and Northern Virginia. As urban neighborhoods change and evolve, some people who were previously living in cities are now moving to the suburbs. The type of people living in suburbs are changing. They are becoming younger, but at the same time, the baby boomers who first moved into the suburbs are getting older and may not particularly enjoy living in a very large detached home and may be looking for other housing options that are smaller, maybe more well connected. And then we can't forget our rural communities in Virginia, which have some pretty serious housing challenges of their own in terms of remoteness, lack of capacity for housing providers in these areas, seniors who may be very isolated, housing quality issues, especially in rural areas with lower incomes, lower wealth, and higher poverty. So we have to think about a regional role in all of this. And over the past few years, regional planning district commissions have become very involved in housing and have helped organize regional housing planning efforts. The New River Valley Regional Consortium, the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission, the Richmond PDC Plan RVA here in Richmond have all been involved in housing planning of some kind. And I think that's going to be a theme that we continue to see increase over time. One case study of this regionalism is the Regional Housing Framework for the Richmond region, which was spearheaded by the Partnership for Housing Affordability, which is a nonprofit organization housed within the Richmond Association of Realtors. This was an effort in 2017 and 2018 to undertake a new type of regional housing planning effort. And so what this effort did was clear off the drawing board and say, we need a new system, a new paradigm really for what a regional housing plan looks like in terms of getting stakeholders to come together, understanding what the needs are, understanding what the solutions might be or might not be, and developing a framework for moving forward and actually getting solutions implemented. So this was an effort that was funded primarily by the philanthropic community in Richmond. Localities and the Regional Commission played an important advisory role and sat on an advisory committee, and obviously were critical for other stakeholders to understand what localities in the region could actually do and could not do in terms of funding, policy, and zoning reform, things that localities actually have under their control. So it was really critical to get these different players in the same room. So in addition to localities and the philanthropic community, which was beginning to understand the importance of housing on a regional level, we had workforce folks in the room from the community colleges, from Goodwill Industries. We had other educational representatives from other higher ed institutions. We had the housing industry representative on the for-profit and nonprofit side. So it was everybody really that's involved in the creation and preservation of housing in the region together in the same room, not under some comprehensive plan or consolidated plan framework, which is very rigid or can be very rigid. And so the drawing board was really clear to begin with. And so one of the main things that folks decided on early on was we don't need a 100-page PDF with a lot of different solutions that are all presented as something that need to get done at some point. Let's take a different approach. Let's say, why don't we develop a menu of different solutions, understanding that we don't know, we may know what our housing conditions look like right now in 2019, but we don't know what they're going to look like exactly in 2029. And of course, a great example of this is that this was all done prior to COVID-19. And so let's understand and pull together a menu of solutions that we all agree there is some sort of political agreement on, that we may have the capacity for, may not yet have the capacity for, but we agree that they are going to meet the current or potential future needs in our region. And maybe we don't implement them right now, but maybe we keep them on the back burner with an understanding that we will take them on in 5 years if a particular need increases. So let's develop this big menu that we can pull from over the next decade, but let's also at the same time not absolve ourselves of any responsibility and pick 10 or 12 solutions that we are going to move forward with immediately. And that was a huge theme in this work, and saying, okay, what are some immediate steps we can take? So we have this big menu, but we have a priority list to begin with. And then recognizing that many plans turn into wonderfully presented documents or websites with really great work that's presented in a very coherent manner, but often get left on the shelf after a few months. One of the major differences in this work was the fact that the philanthropic groups understood that capacity and planning is a major element of getting a plan across the finish line. And so they actually funded a full position within the Partnership for Housing Affordability for the next 3 years for a full-time staff person to be the quarterback for this effort, to coordinate with localities, to coordinate with nonprofits, to coordinate with the state, to see these priority solutions across the finish line and hold stakeholders accountable for actually seeing these solutions implemented. And that has been a huge help. The first big win for this regional effort in the past year, after it's been adopted, is the creation of a housing resource hotline for the region, as well as the creation of a regional homeownership center here in Richmond to help pull together a large number of really impressive but disparate resources throughout the region that are administered through nonprofits, other groups, and localities. Pull them together to give folks who are looking for housing and looking for housing solutions a much easier system and intake process for getting assistance. And that's still very much in its pilot stages, but it was stood up very quickly with the recognition that this was a high-level finding and recommendation under this framework. So this, I think, has been a major success story, and I'm happy to talk about this system in depth anymore offline or via email after this. So I'll wrap up by talking about some of the major trends we're watching here in 2020. So first of all, the elephant in the room, COVID-19. What is going on with the pandemic and housing? First of all, we have major housing instability as the result of the economic downturn following job losses in the spring and the summer. We have a very confusing set of eviction guidelines at the federal and state level. We have a CDC moratorium that's in effect with certain requirements that is not being enforced completely. It is confusing for the legal system, for tenants, for landlords. There is a slow process trying to understand exactly what this means and how it works. But in general, there are still people being evicted due to non-payment of rent, even if they may be eligible for the CDC moratorium. So this is something that state legislators and others are trying to perhaps solve in a more coherent way in this special session. Many of you have probably seen stories in the newspaper or other sources about people moving to the suburbs away from the cities as a way to more easily social distance and find housing that is not quite as dense as some urban communities. But while we have lots of anecdotes about people moving to the suburbs, the researchers at Zillow and some other real estate groups have said, well, really there isn't yet a disproportionate strengthening of suburban markets across the country. Obviously, there may be some metro areas here in Virginia or elsewhere that are seeing that, but it is still very too early to tell whether or not there is going to be a statistically significant migration out of the cities to the suburbs. But that's something that should definitely be on folks' radars over the next 12, 24 months. But it's far too early to dig into the data to understand. And so I think making any policy changes around this will be premature. A lot of people are also rethinking what a home is and what the role of a home is in the middle of a pandemic. We are all spending much more time at home probably than we were in 2019. And so one thing that we're seeing a lot of is localities and developers thinking about accessory dwelling units, not just for a granny flat or for a rental unit, but also as a quarantine pod or for a dedicated space to work from home in, or if you have young children that are still in school, a space for them to learn from home that is not in your dining room. And so I think we will see a wave of localities trying to figure out ways to make accessory dwelling units much more easy to develop to satisfy the needs of homeowners in a pandemic and after a pandemic. And then finally, the home building industry, both on the for-profit and nonprofit side, is coming to grips with how resilient it actually is. Many nonprofits are worried about long-term sustainability. as state and local government budgets may take a hit, probably will take a hit of some kind. And on the home building side, material and labor costs are higher than ever. Lumber costs have gone through the roof over the summer, and some estimates place the additional cost to just a single family home being in the range of $5,000 to $15,000 because of increased material costs, primarily lumber. And so if those don't stabilize and those markets continue to be volatile, housing costs will definitely not get any better. And the production of housing writ large will become harder after the pandemic. Another big thing that's happened over the past year or so is these major paradigm shifts in how localities are approaching the relationship between zoning and housing opportunity. Many of you are probably aware of the Minneapolis plan, which technically got rid of single family zoning across the city, but it really just legalized smaller scale apartment buildings in previously single family only zones. This was not without major debate and contention. The same thing has been happening on the West Coast. Portland had some pretty major zoning reforms. They have also technically ended single family zoning. The story is obviously much more nuanced than that. And Oregon statewide has also done some pretty significant zoning reforms to increase the baseline density in urban areas, non-rural areas that are within growth boundaries. So we're seeing zoning reform not just at the local level, but also at the state level. And Virginia is one of those places at the state level where we have seen some interest from lawmakers to really force the General Assembly to step in and change the baseline densities in localities across the Commonwealth. Delegate Samira introduced a pair of bills in the last regular session to legalize duplexes and accessory dwelling units. Those were passed by, but I believe we will likely see the introduction of very similar bills that may be reduced in scope or tailored to certain areas in the next regular session. And so I think planners should be aware of those. And I think through the APA, many of you probably are very aware and paying attention to those bills that will come back up in the next session. Another big thing that many of you as planners who are out in the community will probably recognize is that NIMBYism, not in my backyard, thinking has evolved. There are still some of the old guard NIMBYs that don't want anything built anywhere, but we are seeing some very different flavors of NIMBYism expand as our political environment becomes very complicated and very charged. There are many examples of kind of progressive NIMBYism in some urban areas where the production of new housing is opposed due to fears of gentrification or displacement. And so these conversations are becoming very nuanced in many places, but primarily within cities. And so a lot of work that we do here at Housing Forward Virginia is helping practitioners and planners understand messaging and the importance of the words that we use and the values that we talk about when we talk about affordable housing. So we have a whole toolkit that I'll link to here in a second, but in general, we want you to avoid backfires. I'm sure many of you have experienced public meetings where you say one thing where you think it makes total sense and it's interpreted in a way that is much different than the way you intended, even if the evidence that you're using for this is fact-based. We want you all to understand that frames matter. The sets of choices about how you present this information are very important. If you use a frame of consumerism or values or other major concepts that define our political conversations, those frames that you use are very, very important and will set the tone for the conversations you have with the community. And then we recommend that you do use values-based messaging, values that are about fairness across places, that everybody should have equal opportunity across a region, that our regions are interdependent on each other for our economies, our transportation, and housing is just another component of that. Those are languages and those are values that people can understand and understand housing as an element of. And as planners, as Mike mentioned, we have a lot of data. The problem is we don't always use that data in the best way. And so we need to be able to build stories with that data and not just throw out a lot of facts and numbers and graphs and maps out there without much context. And so we need to be telling stories. So that's a whole nother topic onto its own that I could spend hours going through, and we have in the past. But if you want to learn more about messaging and ways to overcome NIMBY, you can visit our website. Those are the links there for those respective toolkits. Please take a look. If you're interested in having us do some one-on-one technical assistance or help you figure out a plan that you may be worried about public engagement with around housing, we want to be and we are that resource for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And then finally, I'll just mention 2 opportunities coming up to get plugged in virtually to some housing conversations happening at the state level. Next week, we have a conference that we are partnering with the Manufactured Home Community Coalition of Virginia with, which is called Some Assembly Required. It is exclusively about the mobile home parks and manufactured housing across Virginia. What to do with them, how to handle them, what is their future? What do we do with the residents who are living in these tenuous housing arrangements that may be some of the worst housing conditions in the entire state? Is that a style of housing and a piece of the housing spectrum that our community should retain in some way? These are really interesting conversations that are happening across the state. So I encourage you to attend that conference. And then we also have the annual Virginia Governor's Housing Conference, which is organized by DHCD. That will be later this November. It is normally a very large in-person conference, but will now be a very large virtual conference. And so the registration rate for that is greatly reduced. And I'm sure many of you have attended the GHC at some point. It's always very engaging, always very educational, and would hope that many of you join us for both of these events coming up. So with that, I just have my email here. Again, any of you are welcome to contact me or my colleagues here at Housing Forward. We're happy to field questions from folks across the state. So I'll turn it back over to Paige, and hopefully we have some time to do some Q&A.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And we do have some time for some Q&A questions, so I will jump right in so we do not waste time there. Our first question is about the CM number for this presentation, and that will be in the follow-up email that will be sent to you all, but I have it here just in case. So if you have a pen and paper, the CM number for this webinar is 920-4970. Again, it's 920-4970. Again, it will be in that follow-up email sent to you all later today or early tomorrow morning. Our next question for the presenters is, can you explain what LIHTC is, please?
Sure, I'll just give a quick answer. I am not an expert in the low-income housing tax credit program, but LIHTC is a federal program that was created in the 1980s as part of a tax reform package. It is a housing development program that gives developers a tax break for setting aside a certain number of units, generally all of the units in a new development or rehab development, setting aside those units for households generally below 60% of the area median income. So there is no direct subsidy provided to the developers. It is a tax credit. In many cases, those tax credits are syndicated and exchanged, especially if the developer is a nonprofit with no tax liability. The low-income housing tax credit program, again, is overseen at the federal level by the IRS, not HUD, and the amount of credits available overall in the country is allocated to states by a certain formula. And each of those states will then set the process for how those tax credits are awarded to developments that will apply on a competitive basis to receive those credits. The state level process is overseen by state housing finance agencies. Here in Virginia, that is the HDA, which is now Virginia Housing. They oversee that process through a plan that is updated annually through that's called the Qualified Allocation Plan, the QAP. The LIHTC program here in Virginia produces hundreds of units each year through new construction and rehab, and is the #1 producer of dedicated affordable units throughout the country. The units that are created in the LIHTC program have an affordability period of at least 15 years. In many cases, that goes up to 30. And then at the end of that period, there are different mechanisms for either taking those units out of the affordability period or for re-upping the tax credit or subsidy through different means to keep those units affordable and preserved as affordable housing stock. Mike, you're welcome to add anything else to that.
No, I felt that was pretty thorough.
Our next question is, using the general standard of 30% of pre-tax income in calculating housing affordability is outdated and only permits households to survive, not thrive. I personally used to live in affordable housing, and after 401k contributions, health insurance, taxes, etc., the reduced housing costs I paid were over 50% of my income. In a high cost of living area, this was detrimental to my finances, and I was unable to sustainably build my savings. Hence, the 30% rule allows people to survive but not thrive. I actually regret being part of the program and would have been better off just renting a house with multiple roommates.
Yeah, I think that really gets at the issue between understanding affordability at the community level and at the individual level. I think oftentimes the 30% number absolutely is not helpful to households at an individual level. When we try to look at affordability community-wide, we have to set that standard somewhere. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, it doesn't really describe their situation, and we lose some of the fidelity that we want to get in describing affordability to individual households when we start aggregating. And so that's always the trick, or the difficulty, is to describe affordability at a community level that captures everybody's circumstances. And I think that, you know, obviously as we move forward, we're always trying to find new ways to do that, but we're also trying to do it in a way that fits into the different standards set by different federal programs and state programs, which often use that 30% number to, like Jonathan was talking about, the LIHTC program and the 80% or 60% AMI affordability level. They're using those same standards. And so in that way, we're always trying to understand where households within a region, within a community, fall into those different programs, into those different income limits and those different levels of affordability. And so it's not always a great descriptor of the struggles that individual households go through.
I'll add real quickly that there are some alternative measures out there that are kind of worth an interesting Google if anybody's interested. One is the residual income approach, which basically uses estimates for all the different necessary household expenses, childcare, transportation, groceries, healthcare, you know, everything that you need other than housing to thrive. Estimate those, subtract those from income, and then see what you have left for housing. That's one alternative measure. There's also a measure called shelter poverty, which uses, again, kind of a different way of estimating a cost burden in some way, or housing unaffordability. The issue is those require a lot more data and a lot more estimates to come up with a figure. And so the standard cost burden just has two inputs, which is income and housing cost. And so it's very simple with the data that we do have that census provides. But I think we will see a movement, especially as folks try to understand and grapple with what affordability means, ways to redefine it, hopefully using better and expanded data sources that may become more available over the next few years. So it's an interest of mine to see how these evolve, and may perhaps be a piece of work that our organization looks into in the near future.
How does the affordability equation acknowledge housing maintenance needs as part of affordability? Is there a percentage of annual budget that is recommended in the affordable housing equation?
Generally, when we talk about monthly costs, we're trying to include factors such as, for renters, we're talking about bills, electricity, water, all of your typical household bills that you would need for living in a housing unit. For ownership, that's a slightly different story, but we are trying to capture those bills as well. In terms of the maintenance costs in ownership, that's kind of a different story and sometimes can be hard to capture, although some equations are able to capture it by factoring in assuming a certain amount of housing costs over a 10-year lifespan or a 20-year lifespan. But I couldn't really get into how that's captured in terms of the data that we're using and that's accessible through the Census Bureau.
We have a question about making the slides available via email. Is that something you all would be okay with?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. LIHTC was mentioned several times, as was the need to have different housing products for different types of communities, urban, suburban, and rural. The way LIHTC is implemented in Virginia, it appears to favor the walk-up garden apartment style and force the design choice everywhere because of the point system. Fine in suburban locations, but not an urban design solution. In DC and other states, LIHTC projects are mid-rise and mixed use, but we don't get those in Virginia. How can the point system use be modified to allow for urban style development in urban areas of the Commonwealth?
That's a great question. And again, I will preface this by saying I'm far from an expert in the LIHTC program, but the points that are awarded to particular projects are established by a rubric, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan, which is updated annually by the HDA. There are a number of challenges within the point scoring system, in addition to the type of housing product that's referenced in this question, along with the location and type of neighborhoods that LIHTC developments may get more credit for being in. And so I would encourage everybody to, it's very bureaucratic and very long and hard to get your head wrapped around, but the Qualified Allocation Plan process that the HDA has is the place to make your voice known in that. That is not something that the federal government or the federal program and IRS really oversee. That is a responsibility that is delegated to states. And so I'm happy to share those links if anybody has any trouble finding them. But if you go to VHDA's website and go to their LIHTC program page, you can view the QAP, their schedule for updating the QAP, any and all comments they may have received. I can't recall off the top of my head what the current schedule is for updating it. I think it's normally done in the spring or summer, but could be totally mistaken. But that is a place where planners and housing practitioners and other advocates can make their voice known to let the HDA know, look, our housing need is this, and this is what we feel is appropriate for our community. But here's the conflict that we see with the way that you currently award points to the system. And that's an ongoing iterative process.
Okay, the time now is 1 o'clock, so I will read one more question and then I will follow up via email with the remaining questions. Please explain the demographic population trends in the Commonwealth and how it places pressure on affordable housing and the housing supply. Is the pressure mainly from internal population growth or immigration into the state?
I think both Jonathan and I would both have answers on this, but it really depends on where in the state that we're looking. I think in Northern Virginia, a lot of the growth comes from people coming in from out of state, from out of the country even. If you look in rural areas of Northern Virginia or Western Virginia, the population is kind of stagnating as younger people tend to go to more urban centers where there's employment, and the older population remains and contracts. It's really hard to say statewide exactly what's happening with any clarity.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mike. I think it's kind of a regional question. The two vectors obviously are, immigration or mobility, people literally, moving from one region to another or into our state or out of our state, and how that impacts population and household demand. And then the other vector is just how communities and the households within them change and grow and age over time, and how that transition changes a community's housing need. I think one major piece of the housing demand or changes in housing demand that we're experiencing is our generational evolution. Baby boomers are now, almost entirely into retirement age. Many of them may still be working. That is placing, they are occupying a lot of homes that otherwise could be used for younger families. And so we have that's one example of a mismatch between households and housing units, not just the units themselves, but also the locations of them. We see trends where many people want to stay in cities or move back to cities. How the pandemic may impact that is still, like I said, yet to be seen. But I think we have to, dissect that down into the different components of change, those different vectors. There's no easy answer to that question, but I think it depends on a regional level. And I think that the way that our generations are evolving, primarily the boomers and millennials, as we move into quote unquote settling down age and may want to have children, and may want to upgrade our housing as millennials, come out of their 20s. Is going to be a huge component of that pressure on housing demand.
Okay, thank you again to our presenters, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us live today. I will follow up via email with the rest of the questions. And if our presenters, I will also get the presentation from our presenters as well. Again, thank you to everyone and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.